we can decide that it's called the Gulf of America now. You know what I mean?
Oh my God.
Hello.
Hey,
Welcome to Left on Red. My name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
We're two dudes engaged in a radical self-education.
We're just two guys trying to find inspiration from something other than the poetry of the past.
Ah, yeah, that's good. This episode, we have read Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire.
Yeah, Paulo Freire, he was born in Recife, Brazil in 1921, and he grew up during the most maybe depressed era of the Brazilian economy, as well as a very politically unstable one. They had a populist leader in the 50s that, it's a tragic story. I stopped myself because he ultimately kills himself.
Yeah.
So, whoops.
He mentions it at the end.
Yeah, it is in there. And then in the late 60s, the CIA sponsors a good old coup against their, I guess, democratically elected president, as is the tradition. Mm-hmm. And, instituted, or a dictatorship was instituted. And Paulo Freire was actually exiled as a result. So, exile aside, he had spent 20 years at that point working in literacy with some of the poorest people in Brazil. And it really, as you can see in this book and his many other works, was very influential on how he felt about the concept of liberation as a whole.
Yeah, definitely the forefather of critical pedagogy, and it comes up anytime you start talking about radical education, at least. Maybe not education for everyone, but as I mentioned previously, I actually did read this in grad school as a graduate student when I was pursuing my Master's of Ed, and I recall of my cohort, there were like 14 of us, all in the Masters of Ed program at that time. I was the only one that had anything positive to say about this book at that time. And it's been really interesting to revisit it now.
It's crazy to me that this, by the way, not the book I was expecting. I was literally thinking it was going to be about, not methodology, but methodology, and then to find that this is not just a book about education, but really a book about revolution, I was kind of shocked, that it's ever recommended in America.
Yeah, I think my case was kind of unique in that I don't actually know why we read it. In that the professor that was supposed to teach my class went on sabbatical because she was doing a research fellowship or something in Europe or something. So it was gone for the year, and had a former student of hers come in to proctor the class for us, who was a teacher that taught at the school that we both taught at. And is ultimately why I started teaching there. He is the one that kind of opened the door for me interviewing there because he liked what I had to do in our class and what I had to say about the class or whatever. But he came in. I don't know if it was dictated as a part of the syllabus that this book was on before he proctored, or if he was like, well, if I'm going to proctor, I'm going to teach this book.
Yeah.
And that's what he did. I can't say. I never investigated it further, but it's been interesting revisiting it now because I had no concept of dialectics at the time of reading it previously. And this book is, I think, deeply dialectical and also deeply inspired by Mao, and especially the mass line. And I didn't have a conception of either of those things at the time that I read it the first time. So reading it now has certainly changed my perspective on it, as has one other thing that I'm certain we'll get into as my radicalization has continued. Definitely has colored my opinion of this book the second time reading it. But it's been interesting nonetheless.
Yeah, definitely. Just to speak broadly about it, Paulo Freire is really talking about, really going into this book, what I was thinking about was re-education. It's like the idea that you will have to build class consciousness amongst people in order to make this whole thing happen. And on top of that, there will be a need for education amongst the people broadly as a whole. And so, not to put my perspective in the position of a leader, but it's the idea of what is the best procedure about going through this, not methodologically or anything, but just what does it take to actually make that happen in a liberatory way,
Education of the masses, you mean?
Yeah. Education of the masses in both senses, both pre-revolution and post.
Yeah, I guess I would say, broadly speaking, that's the thing that's most interesting to me about it still, is how interconnected to Freire education and liberation must be. One cannot come without the other. And I think largely an attitude like that is what drove me into education in the first place, because I do believe that to be true. I think I was ground up by the machinery of public education in the United States as it stands as a bourgeois institution. But I do think that there's something really powerful there. It does raise some interesting questions for me. Again, I read this as a pre-service teacher, reading it now, as someone that spent 10 years in the classroom, I have a different perspective on it, certainly. But I don't know, it's raised more questions for me this time about the application of revolutionary education. And side note, I think a lot of what he presents as what he calls problem posing education, the counterpoint to the banking model, I kept like having to check myself, like, how is this different than Montessori? It feels very much like that. And again, I wouldn't have had that kind of perspective at the time when I read it the first time, truthfully.
Well, I wanted to ask, when you started at the school that we worked at, I don't know how easily we can talk about this. Was it still like that kind of crazy ass, like new age schooling shit? Because like my experience teaching there, it was very much a traditional school at that point. I mean, with the exception of one big project that all the students had to do that was meant to be this kind of guiding project.
I came in after that transition had already taken place. So previous to my working there, not by long, maybe 2 years before, our school didn't have traditional GPA. Our school didn't have traditional grading system. And the realities of, I don't know how generously to frame it, but the realities of a school that's built upon sending underserved students to the post-secondary education world, trying to do that and get students accepted into post-secondary institutions when they have no GPA, when they have no traditional transcript to speak of, was too difficult for our school to manage. And so that is what motivated the shift into a more traditional model.
Sure.
And that shift happened before I started. So when I got there, it also felt very much like a traditional school that was being run by well-intentioned people trying to do something different.
Yeah, it was on my mind just because it's something that Paulo Freire talks about in the beginning of this book. The idea of people that espouse these kind of liberatory ideals, even people that don't necessarily recognize that what they might be doing is reinforcing these kinds of structures. To think about the school that we taught at and its transition from this kind of, almost Montessori model, like into something that is focused then on just the rules of society at large, of maintaining the status quo.
And maintaining the carceral state.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking, even though I know that everyone at that school, for the most part, had the best intentions and, like, really gave a shit. I mean, I often said that it was the nicest form of the machine that grinds up children, is, like, really tragic because, I mean, it's exactly what he says in here. It just came to my mind.
Yeah, no, I think that ultimately that's, if not the primary, one of the most important contributing factors that pushed both of us out, is that the recognition of that there was a feeling of inescapability of that kind of perpetuation of the same machine grinding kids up. And there are really great people that still work there, and many of them have the best of intentions, and that's not good enough, as Freire makes quite clear.
Yeah. How do you want to tackle this thing, man?
Well, like usual, I have a couple of like bigger topics, but I also just kind of numbered some quotes in order. So if we wanted to just go from chapter to chapter, I think we could probably do that.
Yeah. I think that the chapters in this book are, they're all woven together, but each chapter really deals with its own kind of topic. And honestly, I think that the first and last chapters are the ones that I got the most from. I mean, I had heard about Paulo Freire talking about banking education before, and so that was kind of, it was just very much like nodding my head, yes. The chapter 3 stuff where they're talking about like generative themes and things like that, I was kind of, snoozing a little bit. But I guess let me just ask you that, like, how important do you feel, because that's a big thing that is talked about in the introduction and also the kind of the afterword, kind of the development of Freirean pedagogy as it's been in the educational system has... What I'm thinking of is in the back matter, they interview all of these prominent educators and, people in academia and stuff, and they talk about how pedagogy of the oppressed has influenced their view, how they came to read it, that kind of thing. And then they also ask, how do you think Paulo Freire would feel about how it's been received today? And almost all of them say, basically, I think he would be very glad to see that it has been, approached and even kind of integrated into our educational system, but at the same time, he would be pretty much dismayed at the way that it's been handled, what the ultimate result is, maybe a focus on methodology or like trying to use it prescriptively. That's the kind of thing that he wouldn't like that much. So I guess that's really my question when I'm thinking about like kind of the things he's talking about in chapter 3, when he's really going into depth about what it looks like to have this kind of dialogical, problem-focused, small group teaching. Is that really that important when it comes to reading this kind of book? And I'm just asking that kind of broadly.
I mean, my answer is no. I think When I first started the reread of this, I was like, oh, I'm going to get to kind of flex some philosophy muscles here again. I feel like those are atrophying, and I was like really excited about that. And as I got into some of the deeper philosophical concepts, I was kind of like, why does any of this matter? Maybe I've become too much of a materialist over the years, but I started asking myself a lot more questions like that, especially in chapters 2 and 3. When it gets a little bit more...
He does diagramming, dude. There's diagramming.
And, one of the other kind of questions that kept coming to me, especially I think it was in chapter 3, was around the need for this understanding of humans as subject. I don't know why that fucking matters. And I kind of kept going into those sorts of questions while I was reading it. So I had already kind of got a bad taste in my mouth with some other stuff that came in the text. So I was reading it very confrontationally.
Yeah.
And so with that in mind, I kept pushing back on like, why do I even care about this? Why should I care about this? So
I'm so glad you brought it up because it's something that I was thinking about a lot. And I think it was actually a big positive of this book for me. Early on when he's talking about the oppressed and oppressor contradiction, the oppressor dialectic, and he quotes Fanon at one point, and I was like, yeah, I'm very much, I was thinking about black skin, white masks in this and like what it means to be othered or the other, in relation to the I and the not I, as Paulo Freire says in here. And I went back and listened to that episode, and, there's this whole bit where I'm just kind of doing like psychobabble, it like literally like dialectical wordplay, trying to figure out this kind of relationship, how to resolve this relationship between oppressor and oppressed. And I think that something really clicked with me here because in all of my attempts to answer that question, even as silly as that bit was, which is, often how I feel when we talk about dialectics, it was still in the framework of master and slave. It was still in the framework of oppressor and oppressed. And I think that something much more interesting is that Paulo Freire makes it very clear that another framework is just possible. There's not one over the other in any capacity, but simply two subjects standing side by side. And I didn't really get a very fleshed out view of the dialectic between subjectivity and objectivity or permanence and change or all the different things he talks about in this book. But I think that something really just struck me when I was thinking about the fact that looking at it in the context still of oppressor, oppressed, master, slave, having that framework in mind is limiting in its own right. You can't necessarily get the answer to the question you're looking for if you're looking through it in just a particular way. So I will say that I'll give this book credit for kind of helping me understand that a little bit.
Okay. I wouldn't say that I walked away with a stronger understanding of that. I think I was asking a lot of the same sort of questions, especially in the context of the human-animal dialectic that he presents, because I think that they're defined in relation to one another, not as individual subjects themselves. And so I think, his anthropocentric primacy of the human experience certainly didn't leave me feeling like I had a stronger sense of what it means to be subject or why why that has value in an argument, or even how you can clearly define that subjectivity in a way that is satisfying to me. So I don't know.
I was going to ask, do you want to try to get through that now, or do you want to try to hold that later? Because there is something interesting when I was going through the notes. In the beginning, he makes these pretty broad statements about. Let me see if I could find the quote. But there were a couple I was going through, and I was just thinking it's so interesting to read these now. These kind of broad ideas about the maintenance of the status quo. Especially when he's talking about dehumanization, the fact that it's a consequence of an unjust order. And it just made me chuckle this morning because going through it, I was like, I know that he's literally in 15 pages about to say, he's about to make all these claims about animals that if you're broadening your scope of oppression, I'll just say it like that, then it would clearly, like these statements also would apply to animals. So then to go in and see Paulo Freire, say, animals don't have agency, they don't have history, they don't have dialogue. Do you want to talk about that now? That's what I'm asking. Or do you want to try to hold out and get to it later?
I don't necessarily want to jump right into my primary criticism with the book. I think there is valuable stuff to talk about in it, so I would kind of like to go in order to avoid jumping right into my biggest problem with it.
Okay. All right, that's fair. Okay.
Let's look at chapter 1. Let's just go chapter by chapter and kind of let it play out how it's going to play out.
Yeah. The word that I'm sure we'll have so much fun saying this entire episode is conscientizacao.
Yeah, sorry. I'm not going to be able to say that. I'm going to call it critical consciousness.
Yeah, conscientization.
Yeah. Also difficult to say.
In the introduction, Donaldo Macedo literally says that part of the issue with its adoption is the fact that it is hard to pronounce, even for Portuguese speakers. And that made me laugh so hard. It is a truly difficult word for my vulgar American tongue to say.
Yeah.
Conscientizacao. All right. It's just the process of becoming conscientious, right?
Yeah, developing a critical consciousness.
Yeah. And it's kind of Paulo Freire's whole thing in this. He's talking about the fact that whether you call it conscientizacao or class consciousness or consciousness as a whole, which he says later, this process of awakening people, essentially, of rehabilitating people, of rehumanizing people. I'm just thinking of all these different ways we've talked about this exact thing over the past couple of episodes. Like, that is the key process in, liberation, in liberatory education, a libertarian education, as he says.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what was primarily most affirming to me and also kind of depressing about my real life experience as an educator, because I do believe that that relationship between education and liberation is immutable. They are connected. They must be connected. You can't have one without the other. And this idea of developing a critical consciousness, I think where I found myself as an educator ready to leave the classroom was acknowledging the reality that can't be compulsory, that desire to be educated in order to further your and your comrades' liberation must come from within. It can't come from without. And so much of the banking model, as he lays it out, is about, you're just a vessel. As a student, you are an empty vessel. You are a repository for the information an educator chooses to give you. And of course, we can see immediately the opportunity for bias and manipulation and all of that sort of stuff that comes from that. But it also secondarily promotes this kind of obsequiousness, this kind of placation, where you don't question those sorts of things, and it perpetuates itself as a system of oppression, and there's no escaping it. In the United States, education is compulsory. You are mandated to go to school. You are not necessarily mandated to learn, but you are mandated to be present, and there's no way you will ever get a truly radical liberatory education out of a situation like that. Now, you can coexist, as I think anyone that has been radicalized in the United States has, with a compulsory education that you still choose to engage with in a way that allows for a more liberatory education to emerge. I mean, obviously, we are willfully reading all of this sort of stuff as students of it. And, I'm sure your context was a little different. I taught in the humanities, so I had the opportunity to actually talk about things like this in my classroom. And there were students that willfully chose to engage and sought deeper meaning and understanding themselves. So I'm not saying that it's completely negating to be compulsory, but it was really affirming to me, to connect those dots in this sort of way and feel confident in my assessment of that.
Well, I think that, it's interesting that you mentioned your experience as an English teacher, how it might be different from mine, because I think that reading this book, it really spoke to me about my experience teaching math. And it's because I really started to feel like culturally rigorous pedagogy, which, is something that it was taught to me in teacher training, all 4 weeks of it or whatever I had. And was something that we talked about frequently, you and me, you and the administration, everybody. I thought it was quite laughable when it came to the context of algebra. I was like, how do you teach this in a way that is culturally responsive, that is academically rigorous and culturally responsive? And I found that to be kind of silly because it's like, I'm limited to trying to connect this to your real world experience in some way that I fear will ultimately be tokenizing. Or I can, write word problems that are also equally as tokenizing. You know what I mean? It feels laughable in the context of math. And I think what's interesting to me about this book and the way that Paulo Freire is talking about dialogue, and he's talking about taking people's experiences and aspirations and all of that and using it in a way that you're posing their experiences as problems, right? You're codifying these things. I didn't catch too much of that, so I don't want to get too crazy on the language here, but actually making a dialogue that allows for people to have this level of conscientizacao, right? That they can actually make those connections and see those connections in the world. That kind of thing is exactly what people want out of the current educational system. It's the kind of thing we talk about when we talk about culturally relevant pedagogy. And on top of that, I taught a math curriculum that was all problems based. It was all problems based learning. And so the idea of having a curriculum focused on problems that people can use their own experiences to then expand their mind in a liberatory education, that's something that I think is hand in hand with the kind of stuff that in the ideal they wanted from me in the math department, and they want from all educators, assumedly. So, I think it's interesting because it is just as applicable in those kinds of fields as well.
My feeling about that is maybe what I have as a criticism of Freire's framing, and not to jump ahead. I know I said we'd be in chapter 1, but to jump into chapter 3, I'm on 112 in chapter 3, but he's talking about an example where you would have a problem posed and then you work communally to decode that and work through it as a learning experience. He says, as each person in his decoding essay relates how he perceived or felt a certain occurrence or situation, his exposition challenges all the other decoders by representing to them the same reality upon which they have themselves been intent. At this moment, they reconsider, through the considerations of others, their own previous consideration. Thus, the analysis of reality made by each individual decoder sends them all back dialogically to the disjointed whole, which once more becomes a totality, evoking a new analysis by the investigators, following which a new evaluative and critical meeting will be held. Okay, that's a fucking pipe dream situation that what I wrote to myself is this requires serious foundational skill. And I think the presumption of how do you make algebra culturally relevant is that it is relevant to critical consciousness to know algebra, to be able to problem solve and to actually know how the universe works. But that's like prerequisite to understanding the cultural connection as opposed to learning the algebra, awakening you to the cultural consciousness. You know what I mean? And so I think there's a problem there where I kept, again, while I was talking back to myself in this as an educator, wondering like, okay, to take it to something as simple as like grammar and mechanics, we want to talk about diagramming sentences or something, right? Like I can have everyone do an exploratory treatise on what a noun is, but the simplest method of getting everyone on the same page to then explore what a noun is to teach them what a noun is, through traditional direct education, direct instruction, and then use some form of exploratory education to really deep dive into why that matters and why they should fucking care what a noun is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so like, I kept seeing like, where is the logical end? Because if this is a zero-sum situation and we're starting from nothing, we don't even have the dialogue. We don't even have the language in order to dialogically explore these ideas together. You know what I mean? It's still built foundationally on a presumption of some sort of banking model education having taken place.
Well, I don't necessarily think so. I mean, I do understand exactly what you're saying. Like the foundations here are what's when we're I know what you're trying to say, but I think that it's wrapped up in when Paulo Freire is talking about the idea of being a student among students, right? Being the student teacher and the teacher student. Mm-hmm. It's like there is still a leader in this process. There is still someone that's guiding this process, but it's just that they're using I don't want to say lived experience, but like they're using the lived experience to inform the conversation in a way. And I really think that there's a bit of an issue in that there's really two classrooms in this book, one that's an actual classroom and one that's a fucking revolution.
Yeah.
And so looking at the whole picture of what he's trying to say, sometimes it's way more applicable to the revolutionary classroom than it is to the educational classroom. Because it is a lot more challenging when you're thinking about like basic skills like that. But I can still kind of understand what he's saying when he's talking about going into what people already know and then using that as part of this problem-based thing.
No, I agree with that. And I think that's kind of where my question was, is like, where is that taking place? Where is that line? Where is the transcendence of that direct instruction into this problem posing instruction? Because I think it's really easy to see when you are talking about something that's subjective as opposed to something that has objective answers, like teaching how to balance an equation. There is an objective end. There are subjective ways to reach it, right?
Sure.
And certainly that exploration is very valid. But teaching in the humanities, teaching English like I did, part of what I found so validating about teaching Othello for the fucking 40th time was that every single year, kids were bringing something to me in their reading of it that I didn't clock in the fucking 40 other times that I read it. I was teaching that play 4 or 5 times a day for 10 years.
Sure.
And every single year, someone would bring something to me that I didn't catch. And there's something super, super dope about that. That, like, you don't have to have a fucking master's degree like I do to read Othello and pull something unique and interesting out of it. But that's inherently subjective. You know what I mean?
Well, the thing that Paulo Freire says to me that works in the objective side is when he's talking about two subjects coming together to name the world. You know, it's like there is still an objective world that is present, but together in this, you know, subject to subject dialectical relationship, we're both agreeing to name the world. You know, I mean, I think that that's kind of the thing there, because I was trying to think of an easy example to kind of lay out something that's like really childish but would still work. And I think it would be something like just numbers as a whole. You know, like, imagine the problem is that I have these items on a table and I need to group them together. Me, the student teacher, and you, the teacher student, can come together and talk about what it actually means to count those things, right? To create numbers in that sense. And that does lead, you know, that flowers out to a broader discussion of other things. And I think that kind of education leads to a much greater understanding, you know.
Agreed.
In fact, I think that, like, so much of that kind of direct application leads to just greater understanding of it at the very root. I mean, so much of my frustration in algebra was the fact that I was trying to teach these really abstract concepts from the pure abstract. You know, it's like, here's numbers that you're familiar with, not that they mean anything to you other than what's on the paper. And now I want you to substitute a letter for that number, which you already don't think of as a real thing. You think of as a fucking mathematical concept, which you've been trained to hate at this point. You know, and so I think that there is something dialogical that would make the teaching of math possible, even if it does start at the very basics, you know? So I think that there is room for the objective in this kind of process. Really, it's when he says naming the world together. You know what I mean? It's not the idea that, like, I know the name and I'm going to deliver it to you. It's that we're coming together and discussing this, and in that process, that action and reflection, we're naming it.
Okay.
I'm just...
No, I mean, I agree with all of that. I still think that there's a logical limited end to that.
Yeah.
There is a point where we can decide that it's called the Gulf of America now. You know what I mean?
Oh my God. You know, I'm not disagreeing with your point, but it just reminds me of in the intro when Donaldo Macedo says that, like, when criticisms come from people like Noam Chomsky asking for, like, real examples of this working, that it does more to hide the truth than it does to elucidate it, you know?
Yeah, it's an obfuscation.
I mean, it seems like it was well received. I mean, certainly.
Over 1 million copies sold.
Right. You know, but at the same time, it makes me think about how much it's been...
bastardized.
Yeah, exactly. How much it's been reified. Yeah. You know, I can't help but think of those things, you know. And I mean, Paulo Freire lived until 1997, so he did get to see a lot of this, be put into play, right? I mean, he literally worked in literacy groups throughout those decades following, trying to put this into action. Like, he wrote other books after this. So it's hard for me to say based on just having read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, you know, but I don't get the sense that I would really enjoy reading
the others
that much else, you know. If you have strong feelings about Paulo Freire's other work and you think it's worth reading in a context like this, definitely let us know.
Yeah, leftandrightfeedback@gmail.com.
Word.
Okay, so just to make some comments about some things in Chapter 1 around the banking model and its implications for education. One thing that stood out to me was when he gets to talking about self-deprecation as a characteristic of the oppressed. And I had to kind of talk back to that a little bit. He writes, self-deprecation is another characteristic of the oppressed, which derives from the internalization of the opinion the oppressors hold of them. So often do they hear that they are good for nothing, know nothing, and are incapable of learning anything, that they're sick, lazy, and unproductive, that in the end they become convinced of their own unfitness. And he goes on to say they call themselves ignorant, say that the professor is the one who had the knowledge and to whom they should listen. The criteria of knowledge imposed upon them are the conventional ones. Why don't you explain the pictures first? That way it'll take less time and won't give us a headache. Like, he's taking the point of view of the peasants here. And I don't know, that kind of spoke to me in a couple of ways, because I've always characterized modesty and humility about oneself as a sign of good, as like an understanding of one's own limitations, you know, in a very kind of Socratic sense. But I can see how its pervasiveness can be weaponized, and that how that can contribute to that kind of fatalistic, I'm only a peasant kind of view. And that characterization of looking to the professor as the expert and the students as the ignorant who just want the answer given to them so they know what to write on the paper so they can prove, like, here's the answer, that not in no way working toward internalizing that or actually wrestling with it themselves or challenging it, because they too have valuable insight that should be pushing back on the professor, right? And that, man, it just brought me back to my experience in the classroom and how disheartening that is to face that every day, you know? Like, what is it you wanted me to write down again? You know, like that sort of thing. It's like, oh, God.
Dude, even in math, man, it was just like, I want you to work through this so you can actually learn it. You know, I don't want you just to see the steps and copy it down. It was every day.
And the challenge of working through it and failing is the valuable part of that process.
Yeah.
But we are so inundated with this conflation of failure as bad, you know, as like a sign of weakness, as a sign of ignorance of all of this, that like students just can't allow themselves to be wrong, to pursue something that ends up being incorrect, you know, or false.
I mean, I think it's even totally recreated in the current thing going on with AI, man. It's like, shut my brain off and just use ChatGPT for not just answering questions or seeking out information, but like literally every aspect of, you know, life. How much of that is just a recreation of the same structure?
Yeah, fuck. That's depressing.
Yeah.
You're right. Yeah.
Oh, God. Just hit me, man.
Okay, let's read some good shit. So early in chapter 1, talking about that dehumanization that you were talking about before, he says this struggle is possible only because dehumanization, although a concrete historical fact, is not a given destiny, but the result of an unjust order that engenders violence in the oppressors, which in turn dehumanizes the oppressed. And I love that not a given destiny thing. This idea that it's prescribed but not destined, you know?
Yeah.
That's good. It fucking sucks oftentimes, you know what I mean? But it doesn't have to. It's not a given. It's not a given destiny. I loved that.
Yeah, just to follow that up too, on 53, there's a footnote from Marx and Engels where he's saying this kind of same thing, and I just love the way that he says this. The quote just says, "The materialist doctrine that men are products of circumstances and upbringing, and that therefore changed men are products of other circumstances and changed upbringing, forgets that it is men that change circumstances, and the educator himself needs educating."
Yes.
Right? It's like we are subject to our circumstances, but part of that is that we make the circumstances. You know, we change the circumstances. We have control of transforming history. The more passive you feel in your position, the more at risk you are of being controlled passively by the society around you.
Yeah, that's kind of the center point of his whole deal, is that what he would call human ability to transform history, to transform your material conditions, to accept what you are being given, and through dialogical interaction, transform and transcend it.
Yeah. Not as the object of history, but as the subject.
Yeah. That's cool.
Hell yeah. Woo!
And, you know, he lays out a lot of the kind of ways that the ruling class will try to make you feel hopeless in that case. Like even just on the page before, he writes, "The oppressor knows full well that this intervention would not be to his interest. What is to his interest is for the people to continue in a state of submersion, impotent in the face of oppressive reality." He's talking about Debow's spectacle, the development of a manufactured reality that makes you feel helpless to do anything to change it.
I was looking on 45 because I just love the way that he says, you know, just kind of talking about the effect of oppression on the oppressors. You know, the quote that I was the most familiar with from this book is one that I didn't even see. And
yeah, same.
Yeah, it's, "If education isn't liberation, the dream of the oppressed is to become the oppressor." And so I was thinking about a lot of that going into it, and I really love what Paulo Freire says here on 45. He says, "The very structure of their thought has been conditioned by the contradictions of the concrete existential situations by which they were shaped. Their ideal is to be men, but for them, to be men is to be oppressors."
Yep.
You know, and there's just so much of that, like keeping the dialectic of oppressed and oppressor, of master and slave, right? Just flipping the poles is not the solution. Just to put the oppressed in the place of the oppressor is not necessarily the solution, you know? And I mean, it even makes me think about when we're talking about like Lenin. Just the idea of making it so that the majority is oppressing the minority rather than the opposite. I had some interesting thoughts about that going into this, because at the same time, Paulo Freire also says that it's not oppression when the oppressed does it, But there's just something interesting about, there is a difference in that and the idea that he's putting forth here of how the solution is not just to flip the poles.
Yeah, that brought me back to a conversation we had very early on around coercion. That idea that it's not oppression when it's being done by the oppressed. And he even says, way at the end on 171, the revolution loves and creates life, and in order to create life, it may be obliged to prevent some men from circumscribing life. This idea that, like, stopping other people from hindering your flourishing is not the same thing as repression.
Yeah. I mean, much the same. I was just thinking of the quote. He says here, not that it is not fundamental to have in order to be human. Precisely because it is necessary, some men's having must not be allowed to constitute an obstacle to others' having, must not consolidate the power of the former to crush the latter, right? Like, it's not about the fact that you need things to live. It's just the fact that everybody needs things to live, You can't be fucking oppressing people based on that, because everybody has that same need.
Yes, and being a fucking trillionaire when people are dying on the streets is oppression, is violence, and it needs to be stopped. Yeah.
Yes, quite literally.
Yeah. Yeah, on 56, something quite similar at the bottom of the page. This may seem simplistic. It is not. Resolution of the oppressor-oppressed contradiction indeed implies the disappearance of the oppressors as a dominant class. However, the restraints imposed by the former oppressed on their oppressors so that the latter cannot reassume their former position do not constitute oppression. That repression is not equal to oppression kind of deal. That's why eye for an eye rhetoric is a false equivalency, and why pacifism will always fail as a political model, because the violence is being imposed upon you. Right. So choosing to be nonviolent is not a response to that.
Yeah, there's at one point where he says that the oppressed have never been violent. How could they be? Because they're being acted upon by violence continuously. In addition, I love that fucking footnote where he says, a dialogue was between the oppressors and oppressed was impossible before the revolution, and so it shall be after. It's just like, You're not oppressed just because we've got you. What page are you on?
On 55. That's where that violence line is.
Oh,
and actually right above that, I have one that I wrote, it's giving bell hooks right next to it. So maybe I should have called this one out before. But any situation in which A, objectively exploits B, or hinders his and her pursuit of self-affirmation as a responsible person, is one of oppression. Such a situation in itself constitutes violence, even when sweetened by false generosity, because it interferes with the individual's ontological and historical vocation to be more fully human. I guess that was just conjuring for me the will to change, and a lot about the way bell hooks writes about masculinity and the oppressive forces of toxic masculinity. And I don't know, but I just saw a relation there.
Yeah, I gotcha.
A couple of quick things here about chapter 1 before we get too far off of moving off of the banking model and talking about that.
Yeah,
I have two thoughts. First, at the end of the chapter, I guess technically this is at the end of chapter 2, but one thing I got to thinking about with the banking model, he says at the close of chapter 2, problem-posing education does not and cannot serve the interests of the oppressor. No oppressive order could permit the oppressed to begin to question why. And I got to thinking about practical limits to the question why in the modern U.S. classroom, and I just jotted a few down because I think there are many factors in the banking model that limit this line of inquiry. Number one is adherence to the curriculum, like whether that's self-imposed or imposed by the district, the adherence to curriculum, because there's state testing, there's teacher rating systems involved, like all of that requires a certain adherence to the curriculum that will motivate a teacher to stop that kind of inquiry-based line of reasoning happening in the classroom. Teachers having a lack of meaningful answers, or there being a lack of meaningful answers to legitimate questions that are posed in the classroom. Like, obviously, being poorly trained as an educator, being poorly educated as a teacher, but also like being asked questions that have very difficult to answer responses can be quite limiting in the classroom, especially in the humanities classroom when you're framing your reading of classic literature like our department did around critical theory. You get into questions that don't have easy answers or have no real answer that are often coming up. And so that can be a limitation. Fear of classroom instability. Like if you have 29 kids in your class, one kid asks a meaningful question, that means 28 kids are now restless bodies in the classroom that are going to be causing some havoc. And then also fear of parent pushback. Like I caught a lot of shit over the years for the stuff that I was teaching in my class, which was milquetoast liberal bullshit. And the amount of parent pushback that I got on that was a significant limitation. Shout out to the district for almost always having my back.
Oh, yeah.
Though. So shout out to them for that. But.
Yeah, it definitely, like, basically every structure that the U.S. educational system has in place is antithetical to the ideal that Paulo Freire wants in this. Like,
exactly, yeah.
Like, I was thinking about, like, what it would take to do this, because, you know, in my classroom, we did 100% of our work was group-based, even tests, you know, it was all team-based. And, you know, much of that was poor execution on my part, that it didn't work so well. I do truly believe that. But it's a real challenge to do. You know, like you said, you got 30 kids in a classroom, even groups of 4, man, that's 7 groups that you have to trust to do on your own. You know, I'm jumping around between them, trying to keep them organized and straightforward and like ask questions about what's going on to each other, not just wait for me to come around.
Yeah.
Like that's impossible. And in like this like ideal, you know, insane, like bootstraps liberal movie from the 90s, like could a teacher take a kid from, you know, any given 9th grade class and teach them algebra perfectly? Yes, but not in 180 days. Like the kind of scaffolding, the kind of legwork that you have to do to get kids up to speed just isn't feasible in the time because, as you said, there's a test at the end of the year.
Yeah.
You know, I can't expand on the kinds of things that I might want to at the ground floor because I've got to teach this one-off case for the 2 questions that are going to show up on the end of course test, man. Like, it's fucking ridiculous.
Yeah, I was lamenting, a coworker of mine asked if I would ever go back to the classroom. And when I was explaining why I wouldn't, I was trying to summarize succinctly why I felt like it was a raw deal. Everyone is being given a raw deal in that. Kids, parents, teachers, everyone.
Yeah.
And I was explaining that I was an 11th and 12th grade teacher. The standards for 11th and 12th grade language arts, I'm supposed to be teaching them parallel structure. And the vast majority of my students didn't have a firm grasp on parts of speech. You know what I mean? Like, didn't understand correct comma placement and how to identify dependent and independent clauses. How are you supposed to teach the higher level of that when you're missing those foundational fundamental skills? And so it's quite difficult when there are such deficits and so many gaps. There's only so much room you can close, you know, in 195 days.
Yeah. I essentially would have had to have taught pre-algebra again, the class that students literally came from before my class.
Yeah.
Because it's like it didn't happen at all, you know? And again, I will say COVID, but...
Yeah, I mean, you came in at a tough time. The decline was steep. I will say, when I started in 2014, things weren't great, but they were way better than they were in 2021.
Yeah.
You know, so that certainly was a big shift.
Yeah, but, you know, as I think we've expressed before on this podcast, I think COVID just allowed the cracks to widen and then nobody, you know...
Those gaps were already there.
Yeah, and they just decided to leave it as it is because they saw that they could operate at that level and still have it exist.
Yeah. Whew. I got one final thought. I guess it's related to stuff from chapter 1. Well, so... he kind of touches on this very early, and then he brings it up again in chapter 4, which is kind of what he does. Everything that he presents in the first 3 chapters, he kind of re-examines in chapter 4. But it struck me when reading chapter 1, the implications for the revolution that the banking model has. And so I wanted to read this quote from chapter 1 and then read this quote from chapter 4. On page 46... he writes, even revolution, which transforms a concrete situation of oppression by establishing the process of liberation, must confront this phenomenon. Many of the oppressed who directly or indirectly participate in revolution intend, conditioned by the myths of the old order, to make it their private revolution. The shadow of their former oppressor is still cast over them. And then he reiterates something similar to that back on 134. Although they, meaning revolutionary leaders, may legitimately recognize themselves as having, due to their revolutionary consciousness, a level of revolutionary knowledge different from the level of empirical knowledge held by the people, they cannot impose themselves and their knowledge on the people. They cannot sloganize the people, but must enter into dialogue with them so that the people's empirical knowledge of reality, nourished by the leader's critical knowledge, gradually becomes transformed into knowledge of the causes of reality. And I like that framing of the people and the building of revolutionary consciousness, of that critical consciousness, and how it can't be, like we've said plenty of times before, like a paternalistic thing that's being handed down from on high by the vanguard.
Yeah.
But instead, the vanguard does have a specified form of knowledge and does have a specific role to play, but it is not one that is more valuable than the role of anyone else involved in the revolution. And instead, it is their mission to uplift the people and learn from the people, rather than to like impose upon them in their own, quote, personal revolution, right?
Yeah, there's a superb Mao quote on 93 in the footnote where he says, "I've proclaimed for a long time we must teach the masses clearly what we have received from them confusedly."
Yeah.
And God damn it, Mao.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
Good shit.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's something really to be said back on 46 about that kind of fear of freedom, something that I love that Paulo Freire says probably in chapter 4 is when he talks about, how the main role is really to pose all myths as problems, right? And the thing is that part of this conscientizacao is that when you're confronted with that problem, you either have to dispel the myth or reaffirm it. A terrifying thing. I mean, it just makes me think of woke again, and not like woke and, like as we're dealing with right now, but just like I'm awake, like wake up sheeple. It's like once you open the eye, how do you possibly ever close it again, And so I think there really just is something to that fear of freedom, both on the side of the oppressor and the oppressed.
Yeah. Speaking of becoming awakened to something that is not evident, I have a fucking problem with his anthropocentric view of animals. It's speciesist and foundationally built on categorically false information. So I think we should get into that.
Okay. I think now is just as good a time as any.
Yeah. So as was intimated at the top of the episode, like he gets into talking about animals at a certain point and drawing these distinctions between non-human animals and the human animal in a way that I take umbrage with, and I think is, one, completely unnecessary to his theory.
Yeah.
I don't think it adds anything to what he's trying to develop. And two, is just wrong. And it's one of those things where he makes claims about animalia that are reductive and monolithic, provides no evidence to back up his claims, and then builds his entire argument on that. And so obviously there's a problem with that, like structurally. I don't think it has meaningful implications for what he's trying to argue about our ability as human animals to transcend the material conditions that we are born into. So I don't really understand why it matters, but it's like he's got a fucking bone to pick because he keeps bringing it up.
Yeah, what animal wronged Paulo Freire?
I know. So, I mean, I guess we should just jump into that.
Yeah, I mean, for one, I definitely agree with you that it's not really necessary for his point. You could definitely excise that whole section, plus all the little jabs he gets in later. No, I mean, I just don't think it's necessary. There's no point of doing that kind of distinction.
Well, okay, first, just to set the stage, I want to read some of the claims that he makes about non-human animals. So these really started for me on page 97, though there are a couple of hints before that. But it's really on 97 where he starts drawing these arbitrary lines between non-human animals and human animals. And he says, "This point deserves more attention. One may well remember, trite as it seems, that of the uncompleted beings, man is the only one to treat not only his actions, but his very self as the object of his reflection. This capacity distinguishes him from the animals, which are unable to separate themselves from their activity, and thus are unable to reflect upon it." I'm already going to interrupt and say, wrong. That's incorrect. There is consensus in the scientific community now that there are many, many animals that have self-awareness, that do have a conception of their place in time. They are not atemporal. They understand the past. They understand the future. And I think if you really want to get into the weeds on it, Freire is making an argument that animals that do present a conception of the future, he would argue that that's a biological response, like evolutionarily speaking, and that it's a survival tactic. My response to that is, what conception of the future isn't?
It's like, if that's the case, then so it is for humans.
Exactly.
Like, yeah.
And I don't necessarily, so I fell into a little bit of a rabbit hole with my thinking around this, because at first I started trying to kind of arm myself with specific examples to rebut each of his claims about animals. Like when he talks about self-awareness, I'm like ready to start talking about chimps, ready to start talking about birds and their preparedness for the future with storing food, squirrels with their preparedness for the future with storing food. But then I started to think like, I don't even really want to play that game, because even though I do think there are specific responses to each of those claims, like, for example, his claim about animals being non-communicative and being non-dialogical, according to whom is really my question. He offers nothing to substantiate that. And we know that there is complex language across non-human animals. I mean, dolphins are probably the most commonly cited example of that. Chimps also.
I mean, even between human and animal, like dogs understand pointing.
I think dogs have a working vocabulary of like 400, 500 words that they understand. That's how they take commands, you know?
Yeah, when I read this, that's really the thing is, like, I know that there's examples out there. I went and even read a little critique of Paulo Freire to see if I could just see some, because that's the thing, is that it really just feels like an outdated belief to me. And I'm not going to give Paulo Freire the benefit of the doubt of the 70s or whatever. People knew better then. But it really just feels like a lot of what he's saying is just like a very gut feeling analysis of animals based on what you observe. And it's just that we've built up the science for me to be like, I know that these are not the same, you know? I mean, but maybe the most available one was dialogue. And it's only in the sense of like, I don't know. It's hard for me to try to put it into Paulo Freire's framework to try to say that, like, yes, animals do dialogue. You know what I mean?
Well, and that's why what I was going to say is that I found myself falling down that rabbit hole trying to rebut each individual claim. And instead, I decided that I think that it's flawed from the outset to do that. What I wrote to myself was that anthropocentric assumptions developed in his argument with no evidence turns into outright speciesism, because he's using human framing to measure the worthiness of animals as a means of negating their oppression, the oppression against animals. That somehow looking at non-human animals through the lens of our understanding of the human animal is, I think, being done purely just to negate the clear oppression that is taking place against non-human animals constantly. And I disagree with the idea, this is where I think the subject-object dialect comes into play, because he makes the claim that only a subject has the transformative energy to change their material condition. And that's why animals are objects and humans are subjects. And then to back that up with evidence, a tumbleweed flies by and crickets chirp in the background, you know, because he just makes a claim like that and then can't substantiate it. And I don't think that that's valid. And that's why I think a clearer understanding of what it means to be subject is very important if you're going to bring that into the conversation. I don't actually think it's that important in the context of the conversation to begin with. But I don't even think he could substantiate a definition of subject that doesn't also invalidate a good deal of non-human animals. Let me say this. I don't think there's a claim that can be made that discounts non-human animals' legitimacy as subjects that doesn't also discount infants, doesn't also discount adult non-human animals with developmental disability. And I just don't see how you can square one with the other, you know? And it really fucking changed the way I read the rest of the book. And I was really mad about that.
Yeah, when you texted me, I was like, I knew it was coming.
Yeah.
I knew it was coming.
I was not vegan when I read this the first time. I was a vegetarian, so I was a welfarist. It was not a position that I think has moral standing. But nonetheless, I can't believe that I didn't remember any of that.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I really feel like it would have stood out to me even back then. Maybe I'm rewriting history. But
well, I think it also proves the point that it's just not important to the larger conversation. Like, the stuff that sticks with you from this book has nothing to do with his analysis of animals at all. It's like all of the things about conscientization, about banking education, about even the role of leadership in revolution, I think still holds its own completely without any of these sections, you know? I mean, I know that's what you're saying, but
yeah.
And so, like, yeah, I don't think it's important to even worry about.
I mean, it bothers me largely because there's already, I think, a significant deficit in leftist theory with the consideration of animal liberation. And to see something that's so highly touted, over 1 million copies sold, to just carry that kind of anthropocentric line into the realm of human supremacy or speciesism without it being challenged is really bothers me quite a lot. Even though it does nothing to add to his theory. So, like, there is still valid stuff in here, but it's hard for me to roll with that when I see just this, like, very clear deficit. And that being said, you could make that same argument about pretty much, if not every other book that we've read for the show anyway. I mean, I've already I know when we were reading Capital, pointed out some stuff with Marx that I thought was problematic with his view of animals. Freire does raise the question about if animals labor, which came up on the show before. I'm still not sure I validate that as a necessary question to ask, like in the context of the conversation of animal liberation, but I do think it's an interesting one to explore at least.
Well, another thing that I think about is the fact that Freire is open to critique of this. He's not so steadfast in this. Like in the introduction, Donaldo Macedo talks about how there was a lot of critique of this book about it not addressing necessarily the avenues of race. There's a point at which she says, like, isn't it in the preface actually where Paulo Freire is like, I'm sure that, you know, a deeper analysis of some of this stuff can be made, and I'm excited for people to do it, you know? And I think that this is another avenue just like that.
I think he was open to the criticism of his work, as he should be, because some of it's dog shit. So yeah, I would agree. I wish there was more readily available critique of this through that lens, through an anti-speciesist animal liberation lens. I did find a couple of pieces of writing, but I found them to be like so esoteric and kind of entrenched in academia that I didn't think they were that valuable.
Even the one that I read was very much just like, these vegan philosophers say this and that, and I think that it's correct. You know, Paulo Freire, you're wrong.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, cool.
Well, I mean, okay, I know that I said I didn't think it was valuable, but I do want to point out, at least, just humor me for a moment. On the bottom of 97, when he's talking about this distinction between the human animal and the non-human animal, he says, in this apparently superficial distinction lie the boundaries which delimit the action of each in his life space. Because the animal's activity is an extension of themselves, the results of that activity are also inseparable from themselves. Animals can neither set objectives nor infuse their transformation of nature with any significance beyond itself. And that's just categorically false. I feel obligated to tell you that goal setting is an evolutionary adaptive behavior that is mapped out across all animals, human animals and non-human animals alike, all the way down to E. coli. E. coli fucking gene switch to prepare for their environmental changes when they know that it's coming, to prepare themselves for their material conditions being different. They make that change. Chimps also have a clear conception of their past and their future selves, as I mentioned before. So, like, it's just wrong, and we should push back on those points.
Yeah. Again, though, this is in 1970. It is just wrong. Like, we know better. And they did then, too. But we definitely do now.
Yeah, and just broadly his position that animals seek only to behave individually, not culturally, not like... That's just... How do you even get to that?
Yeah.
That's so fucking wrong. I don't know. I just wrote... He just stays being wrong about animals. That's what I wrote at the bottom of this page because I was getting so pissed.
There you go.
But anyway, if you're a vegan, there is still valuable stuff from Freire's theory. You just got to get past all this speciesist nonsense bullshit.
Fair and valid. I see you. I hear you. You are valid.
Yeah. Anyway, we can go past that now. I don't have anything more to say other than to just point out where he's wrong.
Yeah. No, I think that's totally fair, man. I mean, you're so much more well-equipped to have this argument with Paulo Freire than I am. That when I read this, I was just like, I'll just wait and...
Well, what was really affirming for me is that I was reading this and I was like, oh my God, here we go. And I texted you about it and you were like, yeah, no, I noticed that. And I was like, yes. Will clocked it.
Listen, man, as soon as we had that whole vegan discussion on the Beyond Nature episode, it has permanently changed how I view animal liberation, you know, even as just a possibility or what it means. So, you know, yeah, great job. You know, it's part of my radical self-education too, even though I'm going to go home and smoke a rack of ribs and drink a beer or whatever, you know, sorry. I mean that in a joking way. I didn't mean that. That sounded so much crueler when I said it out loud.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it makes sense for us to talk about it on the show, but it's very difficult to navigate as a vegan in a non-vegan world and to recognize the limits of how and when to talk to people about animal liberation.
Yeah.
Because I think when you equate it to any other liberation movement, people have a very different attitude toward it, largely because most of those other liberation movements, they can say they're against it, and that's all they ever have to do. Animal liberation, you have to be about it. And so I think people have a harder time with taking a principled position on it because it actually has to change the way that you navigate the world. And I don't know. I've always felt very self-conscious about talking about it on the show. Even that Beyond Nature episode is very much part of that self-consciousness as well, because I don't ever want to make you feel like you're being put on the spot or having your fingers pointed at you. But it's also very difficult to talk about the realities of the way that we navigate the non-vegan world without acknowledging our complicity in it. And it's like every argument that people make against veganism, against animal liberation, if you have any other liberatory correlation to that, they have the opposite attitude toward it, you know? And it's very frustrating. It's like you can't be a reducitarian when you're talking about beating your wife. I only beat my wife once a week, so it's not that big of a deal. You can't be a little bit racist. You know what I mean? Like, well, I just use the N-word sometimes.
Well, I'm just selectively racist, man.
Yeah.
You know.
Like when you make those sorts of connections, I don't know. It's very clear to me, but I also don't want to be a confrontational asshole with everyone. And I don't know. It's just very difficult to navigate.
Yeah. I mean, just like when we talked about it the last time, I think that the thing that I was thinking about was where's the point of unity, especially when we're talking about other liberation movements, so to speak. It's so tough because people really feel a sense of primacy. I mean, of like, there's an urgency in those kind of liberation movements that people just don't have when it comes to animal liberation, because in the same way that Paulo Freire is talking about that fear of freedom, like I have to either dispel these myths or reaffirm them. It's like you have to reckon with the myths of oppression when it comes to animal liberation in a way that is very much, like you said, much more entrenched in people's lives than some of these other things. Like it's very easy for me as a white man to be pro-liberation in so many different ways because I don't have any skin in the game, All I have to do is be here. And in many ways, it's just a consumptive thing. Like I just change my consumptive practices, but animal liberation is just much more tougher because I would have to make a literal lifestyle change,
Yeah. And where I don't get along with other vegans oftentimes is my attitude toward what that looks like in the future, because I do think that there is an urgent need for animal liberation. And I think like all animal agriculture needs to stop, needs to stop. But there are pragmatic issues that come along with that position that we do not currently have the infrastructure to manage, right? That's why I think I mentioned it on the show. I've been kind of thinking about veganism in phases.
Yeah.
I think the first phase is the urgent need to stop all animal agriculture, right? That's not going to be a problem with feeding people. That we're not going to go hungry because most of the food that we grow is currently being used to feed those animals, and we can just eat that food instead. But that does create a problem with, the 4 billion land animals that get murdered every year. They're still going to be on the planet now. Of course, there won't be 4 billion of them, and where are they going to go? What's that going to do? There are pragmatic questions that need to be answered there. Secondarily, I do think in a post-revolution rebuilding of society, we need to do that with animal liberation in mind. And I don't think thinking about it then is the answer.
Sure.
I think this is why, though I agree with the reality that me being vegan has no material change for animals' lives today, like I'm not saving animals' lives by being vegan. I think that's a story that people tell themselves. The same number of animals are being slaughtered.
Sure.
That's only just talking about food production, too. I mean, veganism goes beyond that with all animal use, but just to simplify the conversation a little bit, I don't think that I'm saving any animals' lives by being vegan, but I do think we have to organize from that position in order to build the world that we want to see in a post-revolution situation. And so I think if you can be vegan, you should be vegan.
It's dude, it's just so funny to hear you talk like this because it's exactly the same parallels that Paulo Freire is talking about in these things where he's saying like, we need to act dialogically now. Like we can't use anti-dialogical practices to get at this point and then think about it after the revolution,
Yeah.
Because like, it's about cultural revolution too, It's about everybody being willing to accept this praxis, in the case of veganism, it's this like total lifestyle change. I mean, not total, you know what I mean though. And it's like, it's a question of when is that being implemented, right? You can still use those dialogical practices now in preparation for this, even if it is a distant future thing, And it's just it really, really funny to have this kind of conversation and be like, it's so separate from this book, because it's not. It's the same kind of dialogical process that we're talking about, And when we're talking about putting the problems of society forward and then addressing them as subjects naming the world, right? Looking at the structure of our food supply in relation to the 4 billion animals that would still have to be dealt with, that's part of it. That's a dialogical problem right there.
Yeah. Land animals, by the way, if we start talking about fish and stuff, it goes into the trillions. But yes. And that's also why it's so fucking frustrating to see Freire make these arguments about animals, because he's doing the thing that he says he's not supposed to.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
This was good.
Okay. Have you strong feelings about the banking model of education, Aaron?
That is the thing that I remembered from the book, but rereading it now, I do feel like I have a stronger conception of how it worked. I used to just talk about it like almost like a commodification model of seeing. I remember specifically using the language like empty vessel as a repository, not as a person, but as just a place to put this information.
Yeah. No, I totally get it. I mean, it's very weird teaching math and thinking about this kind of thing because in so many ways it's very much like I had to, it's just the same thing. I had to make the jump from thinking like, I have this knowledge and I'm going to give it to you, to it's much more valuable for you to understand why these things are happening, you know, to look at the root of these problems, even if it means going back classes and steps behind and starting from scratch. So, yeah.
I mean, it's just, so my dad is a very hands-on kind of guy. He's worked on cars his whole life. I mean, that's what he went to school for.
Yeah.
He used to run a garage. He builds race cars now. Like,
hell yeah.
And it was always fascinating to me to learn car shit from him. I don't like working on cars, but I liked working on cars with my dad because it's like, okay, well, I've got this leak here. And he could show me how to fix the leak, but understanding what in the system caused that leak to take place and helped me understand the system as a whole. Yeah. And like putting the whole bit together made every individual piece make a lot more sense.
Right.
And so like to take a piece of information out of in isolation, you know, there is limited value in that. There is value in it, but it's limited. But when you can contextualize it into the whole system and then, you know, take that, he even has a quote here where he kind of talks about that ever expanding kind of evolution where you're taking that individual thing into a system and that system into its context of a larger system and all of that. That's where the deeper connections are made. Not only is that what's helping your brain literally remember it and actually build new, you know, neural pathways to those synapses firing and making you a smart person.
Yeah.
That's just also where the value in that education comes from. So yeah, learning how to solve for X is fine, but understanding what that means in the larger context is really what's valuable. I don't know. I kind of lost my train of thought.
Well, I think it, you know, not to like overinflate this metaphor too much, but I think it even goes to where when Paulo Freire is talking about the possibility of seeing beyond the perceived reality, you know, it's like, it's not just the part in isolation, but it's also the connection. It is the sum of all of its parts is a little greater than just each thing in isolation because it's showing those connections as well.
Yeah. And you got to know the rules to break them, like we said. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. To transcend them.
Hell yeah. I don't have like too much to say about chapter 3. Really, I guess the thing I appreciate the most about chapter 3 is just talking about praxis as being this kind of thing. The difference between all theory, no action, all action, no theory. That stuff is nice, but it also feels kind of self-evident at this point.
I would agree. I did really like the line that he uses at the end of that first paragraph there. He says, "There is no true word that is not at the same time a praxis. Thus, to speak a true word is to transform the world." I think that's cool. I like that. But I would agree. I didn't take a whole lot from chapter 3. Chapter 3 was mostly the animal stuff for me. I will just point out one other thing from chapter 3, I guess, on page 90. This is maybe me punching left a little bit, but Freire writes, "On the other hand, dialogue cannot exist without humility. The naming of the world, through which people constantly recreate that world, cannot be an act of arrogance. Dialogue, as the encounter of those addressed to the common task of learning and acting, is broken if the parties, or one of them, lack humility. How can I dialogue if I always project ignorance onto others and never perceive my own? How can I dialogue if I regard myself as a case apart from others, mere its in whom I cannot recognize other I's? How can I dialogue if I consider myself a member of the in-group of pure men, the owners of truth and knowledge, for whom all non-members are those people, or the great unwashed?" I think that that's really just a great reminder, especially for theory heads, to like take a step back.
Yeah.
Sometimes, you know, I mean, I think communists fall into this often, and especially left comms really
Trots.
come off like this a lot. Yeah. But just like cool your jets a little bit.
Yeah.
Come back down to the people and meet them where they are. You don't have to talk above them or see yourself as above them.
That's what always kills me when people are like, I just think that people are too stupid, you know, like I think that these sheep, you know, will never be able to do revolution, we're fucked. It's just like, it might feel that way right now, but it's not like oh, hang on. I was about to say, it's not like we're getting any dumber, but shit.
I mean, we are objectively getting dumber, but there is still nothing that is beyond the critical consciousness of the people.
Yeah, exactly. You got to have some faith. We're communists, goddammit.
Yeah.
Some faith in the people, pardon.
Exactly.
Let me be clear. Yeah.
Without this faith in the people, dialogue is a farce which inevitably degenerates into paternalistic manipulation, says Freire.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. That's all I got for 3. Well, I'm happy to go to 4.
Okay. This is really the chapter about revolutionary leaders.
Yeah.
Be with the people. Be one with the people.
It's very Mao, very mass line. Yeah. 128. Dialogue with the people is radically necessary to every authentic revolution. This is what makes it a revolution, as distinguished from a military coup. One does not expect dialogue from a coup, only deceit or force. It's big Mao vibes, this whole chapter.
Yes. I'm looking at 130 here. What I want to talk about in this section is when he's talking about communion with the people.
Yeah.
Right? And I love that he uses the word communion there. But just to further that, when he talks about Fidel and Che Guevara, like something I really loved is the quote from Che Guevara when he says that communion with the people wasn't something that we just practiced. It was just it became an integral part of our lives. You know, he says peasants and guerrillas rising up in one mass. Mm-hmm. And I just think it's so nice to see that actual kind of thing. You know, like I've said before that something I really love from the Chinese Revolution is the idea of the people standing up. You know, it's like this is everybody, one people, ourselves included as part of that people, are choosing to stand up. They're standing up and recognizing the situation, what it takes to transform this reality, the charge that they as a people, a single body, have to transform this. So much of this book gives me that same kind of feeling, because it's that same moment of like realization, of conscientization, that you realize that like I have agency to transform this world. You become part of that mass, you know. Mm-hmm. You become not an object being acted on by history perhaps, but the subject of history along with your fellow subjects. You're coming together to name the world. All of those things. I mean, like, this book really does give me that revolutionary sense in that way. And it's just something that I really appreciate. And it is very Maoist, very Mao forward. He does talk, you know, Cultural Revolution in here as well. Very early on, might I add, in the years of the Cultural Revolution. So I'm curious to see, maybe that might be one of my questions, is what did Paulo Freire think of the end of the Cultural Revolution?
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Because it had just started. I mean, it was, I don't know. Mao dies in 76. I know that for a fact.
Yeah.
So, curious. He does mention on 162 the idea that reform is just so often there to stave off revolution.
Oh, yeah, I have that.
Which I thought was very fun. You know, let us carry out reforms before the people carry out a revolution. Very telling. I mean, there's just something historically accurate about when Paulo Freire says that action is the vehicle. You know, action is what really transforms society. Because anytime I think about the kind of gains we've made as society, they all come from things that ultimately are non-political in the traditional sense. You know, it's like movements of people on the streets, organizations of people, and very rarely is it something that comes down to reform, even if a reformist thing like a law might be the end result. It's always the authentic organized action, as Paulo Freire says, of these people that actually drives this change in society.
Yeah, near the end of this chapter on 182 and 183, he's kind of talking about errors that can be made in revolutionary movements and how you can become so focused on like a particular material change, for example, that you skip the necessary cultural synthesis that would actually move the people beyond that material change, and instead help them recognize that that material change is part of a larger demand, you know? And I was thinking a lot about trade unions. This is what made me think of it. Like, there have been gains made by like the trade unionist movement, for example, in the 20th century in the United States. Those gains have almost all been entirely walked back at this point, as all reforms can and ultimately will be. But I don't know. I guess I'll read the quote because I'm kind of losing my train of thought here. On 183, he says, the solution lies in synthesis. The leaders must, on the one hand, identify with the people's demand for higher salaries in this case, while on the other, they must pose the meaning of that very demand as a problem. And that also calls back to, on 152, Freire tells us at the end of that section, the revolutionary leaders should take advantage of the contradictions of manipulation by posing it as a problem to the oppressed with the objective of organizing them. Yeah. So this is, again, an application of that kind of problem-posing education in a revolutionary sense, and how revolutionary leaders need to use the same sort of methodology of posing these problems to the people to help expose the contradictions of capitalism that will help enlighten their own critical consciousness that helps uplift everyone else in the revolutionary movement.
Yeah, just as you said, man. I mean, it's just so mass line. Like, it's just this whole idea of like seeing what the people need, and then the kind of dual power that you create when you're fulfilling those needs, when you're posing solutions to those problems, so to speak. That's the organization that is leading to this kind of class consciousness. Like, it's just totally wrapped up all together like that. And it's not for the people, but with the people.
Exactly. Yeah. Also, shout out on 163. He's talking about folks that have moved from the kind of upper strata, the ruling class, and then find themselves in revolutionary leadership. He says that these people often come from, well, I'll just read it. He says, usually this leadership group is made up of men and women who in one way or another have belonged to the social strata of the dominators. At a certain point in their existential experience under certain historical conditions, these leaders renounce the class to which they belong and join the oppressed in an act of true solidarity. And
or so one would hope.
Or so one would hope, yeah. But I mean, that just called to mind. I mean, obviously, Marx and Engels are to a degree exemplified in that. Definitely Kropotkin is exemplified in that. Che Guevara is exemplified in that. And I just think that that's super dope. Like, being born rich doesn't make you a dick. You can still actually be in true solidarity with the people. That's just cool. That's cool, man.
Yeah. I've just had this recurring thought over the last couple of weeks where it's like I feel less like a class traitor and more like a class failure, you know? just really shit and ass. Like I don't know, not important. Honestly, you know what it really reminds me of is that great exchange between Zhou Enlai and Khrushchev, where Khrushchev says, "You're the son of peasants, I'm the son of pig farmers, I think, and now we're both here." And Zhou Enlai says, "Yeah, we're both traitors to our class," which is so fucking funny. No, I don't remember. I probably just bungled that, but it doesn't matter. It just cracks me up. Oh, one other thing I will say, I mean, yeah, that we're just doing the cavalcade, basically. On 178, I do love that he says, because there's a moment where he talks about anti-authoritarianism, basically. And it was interesting to see that. I do think that there's some sly shots in here at the USSR. You know, I think he talks about points where revolutionaries allow bureaucratization to, slide in and take over, and it recreates those forms of oppression, or the dialectic relationship or whatever. I just like this at the bottom of 178. He says, organization is rather a highly educational process in which leaders and people together experience true authority and freedom, which they then seek to establish in society by transforming the reality which mediates them. And there's just something that really spoke to me there about when he says true authority. And so many times when we talked about the role of authority in society, it's come down to this idea of like this kind of voluntarily given thing. You know, it's like we will still have authority in this thing. It's not that it's necessarily hierarchy in the same sense, because it's something that we recognize as being necessary for the organization of society, for the mediation of society even. It's giving me that kind of ideal justice or ideal truth, or when we're talking about rights being guaranteed through action and not through laws, basically through words.
Constitution or something.
Yeah. It's kind of giving me the same thing here. Like, what authority actually means, not power, that's too charged of a word, but like what authority actually means is going to be found, going to be recognized through this kind of praxis, through this kind of organization, through this relationship between not oppressor and oppressed, master-slave, but again, as two side-by-side subjects. Because, what they're doing there is naming what authority is, right? I mean, they're reflecting on what authority was named in the past and then moving forward with a future perception that they have come to in consensus, in dialogue. I just really appreciated that, because we've talked so many times about what a true ideal is in some of these concepts, freedom especially. And I think that this just did something to, kind of expand on that.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good point. That's well said. I'll read a line from 178 as well, because I noted the kind of freedom authority dialectic that he's put together here. Because he says, the dialogical theory of action opposes both authoritarianism and license, and thereby affirms authority and freedom. There is no freedom without authority, but there is also no authority without freedom. All freedom contains a possibility that under special circumstances and at different existential levels, it may become authority. Freedom and authority cannot be isolated, but must be considered in relationship to each other. I thought that was great. Yeah. I agree. That kind of like sealed it up a little bit more for me.
Yeah. Shout outs. It's staving me off from having to read Hegel. That's the nice thing about all the dialecticalness in this.
Well, why don't we just go ahead and jump into the cavalcade, because we're already kind of doing it anyway. So let's just go to the cavalcade of quotes.
It's the cavalcade.
I have one on charity on page 50.
Oh, yeah.
And why charity will always kind of fall short. And I was deep in my philosophy lens here at this point still, because this is very early in chapter 1. So at the top of the page, he writes, "The oppressor is solidary with the oppressed only when he stops regarding the oppressed as an abstract category and sees them as persons who have been unjustly dealt with, deprived of their voice, cheated in the sale of their labor. When he stops making pious, sentimental, and individualistic gestures and risks an act of love." And that's where I wrote why charity will always fall short. Because solidarity is deontological. It's not consequentialist. This is why charity is counter-revolutionary. It holds the receiver of that charity in a subordinated, supplicated caste, and that will always reinforce that oppressed-oppressor duality. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's lots of really good times in here where he's talking about that kind of aid thing. Like, I love on 48 where he says that they prefer gregariousness to authentic comradeship, right? The security of conformity with their state of unfreedom to the creative communion produced by freedom, and even the very pursuit of freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much.
Great.
It's the fear of freedom, man. Yeah. I had the one on 68 that I really appreciate. He says, "The struggle begins with men's recognition that they have been destroyed. Propaganda, management, manipulation, all arms of domination cannot be the instruments of their rehumanization. The only effective instrument is a humanizing pedagogy in which the revolutionary leadership establishes a permanent relationship of dialogue with the oppressed." And it's that permanent dialogue that's really it. It's not just, a means to an end. It is the process. It is the whole.
Yeah, for sure.
There's another great one on 74. It says, "These marginals need to be integrated, incorporated into healthy society they have forsaken. The truth is, however, that the oppressed are not marginals, are not people living outside society. They have always been inside the structure which made them beings for others. This solution is not to integrate them into the structure of oppression, but to transform that structure so that they can become beings for themselves."
Yep.
Now, it just made me think of the animal labor question again.
I was thinking the exact same thing.
It just made me think of the animal labor question again.
Okay.
Because what would that mean for an animal to be a being in itself? Just to... No, actually. Nope. Nope. Anyway, what were you going to say, Aaron?
No, I mean, I think that this is endemic of his kind of anthropocentric view, where he later says that animals can only be...
They're mere props, Aaron. They're just props in my human play.
There's so much bonkers shit that he says about animals.
He'll just slip it in a line. He'll be like, yeah, dude, even when we were reading those quotes, I love that he says, "Trite as it may seem, yeah, it does actually seem quite trite."
Yeah. At the start of chapter 4, I wrote, "Dude, get over it," because the first 2 of the first 3 paragraphs are all about him shitting on non-human animals. But he says, "Animals who do not labor," I'll say, "live in a setting which they cannot transcend. Hence, each animal species lives in the context appropriate to it, and these contexts, while open to humans, cannot communicate among themselves." What kind of jargony nonsense is that? Are you telling me that humans don't live in a context that is appropriate to them? And additionally, live in a setting in which they cannot transcend. I know that he's talking about praxis as the means of transcendence, and his whole deal is that if you can't use communication as a means of praxis, then you can never transcend the conditions that you are in. And I think he's just making an assumption that animals couldn't do that.
Yeah. They can't communicate. They don't speak English, Aaron. They don't even speak Portuguese.
Doi. Yeah.
What the hell are you talking about?
I don't know. That's still not the one I was thinking of, but what the fuck, man?
I don't know. I didn't mean to crack it back open like that.
Okay. Okay, maybe it's this one. On 107, he says, "We must realize that the aspirations, the motives, and the objectives implicit in the meaningful thematics are human aspirations, motives, and objectives. They do not exist out there somewhere as static entities. They are occurring." My response is, nah.
That's interesting, though, because I actually read that quote totally differently. I mean, the human aspect of it isn't what didn't even jump out to me there, because it was just the idea that it's like, kind of like when he says later that the experiences that people really have, all their beliefs and, even their crazy syncretic religious beliefs are still something that need to be considered. That's how I read this quote, saying that these thematics, these things that are driving people, those are actually their aspirations, right? It's not that there's not just like occurring aspirations out there like, oh, religiosity is just some floating concept, but it's actually things that people practice in their own right, especially with religion. Like, that's why I think it's so funny he puts mostly syncretic in parentheses later on, because it's like, yeah, so much of these things are cobbled together, but that's not the point. It's not based on some ideal Christianity. It's the fact that these aspirations, so to speak, are things that actually drive how people live. It's part of their lived experience. So I didn't actually think about the human specificness, the anthropocentricness of that at all. That quote was actually one that I had to read.
The point about religion, though, brings up a quote. I'm going to skip to the back on 164. He says, "It is extremely unlikely that these self-mistrustful, downtrodden, hopeless people will seek their own liberation, an act of rebellion, which they may view as a disobedient violation of the will of God, as an unwarranted confrontation with destiny." And this is kind of an encapsulation of my beef with revolutionary religion in general. Like the idea that, I know that I'm coming at this with considerable bias, but this is, to me, a representation of how religious thought is synonymous with dogmatism, and that dogmatism is always going to be then an oppressive force, a counter-revolutionary force that will stop people from examining their conditions meaningfully, and instead gives them a cop-out, like a way out of it being somehow preordained or predestined and no longer something that they have control over transcending or changing in any way.
I mean, it literally is a recreation of the master-slave dialectic in which you are always the slave.
Yeah, that's what Nietzsche would say.
Yeah, there's always a higher power up there, and it's God. It's completely out of my control because this framework exists outside of reality even. Like an amazing quote that I was trying to find a second ago where he says, as if God could have created this disordered organization. It's like if God really were to make something perfect, you think this would be the shit that he made? This fucking horrid dreck we live in? Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
God invented child cancer.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wish I could find that quote because when I read it the first time, I was like, ooh. Yeah. It almost always is related to the power of destiny or fate or fortune, inevitable forces, or to a distorted view of God. Under the sway of magic and myth, the oppressed, especially peasants, who are almost submerged in nature, see their suffering, the fruit of exploitation, as the will of God, as if God were the creator of this organized disorder. Yeah. That's a good one right
Banger.
there.
Yeah, that one's dope.
I do appreciate that he says the kind of love that, basically the idea of the oppressor also being liberated with this, with the oppressed. I was just seeing the quote on, he talks about it a lot early, but the quote I just saw was on page 90. Only by abolishing the situation of oppression is it possible to restore the love which that situation made impossible. I don't have the other quote right here, but there's another one earlier where he's talking about like literally rehumanizing the oppressor through that kind of thing. And I do really appreciate that because
I think I've got it here on 56.
Yeah.
Because revolution is love. He says, whereas the violence of the oppressors prevents the oppressed from being fully human, the response of the latter to this violence is grounded in the desire to pursue the right to be human. As the oppressors dehumanize others and violate their rights, they themselves also become dehumanized. As the oppressed, fighting to be human, take away the oppressor's power to dominate and suppress, they restore to the oppressors the humanity they had lost in the exercise of oppression.
Yeah, I love that. That's just a holistically beautiful statement, right? Yeah. Not all hope is lost, This violence that's coming, it'll be a loving violence.
Yeah, and I mean, for the vegans out there, there's something wrapped up in the concept of personhood in that as well. Personhood is something that we are granted, meaning that we are recipients of moral consideration. That's how I would define personhood. And it's something that we're granted, but it's not something that is guaranteed to remain. You can lose your personhood through your behavior, through your action. As an oppressor, you are potentially giving up your personhood in the pursuit of dehumanizing other people. You are robbing them of personhood by not giving them moral consideration. That, to you, is also removing your personhood, your moral consideration, right? But I think there's something really beautiful in what Freire is saying is that the violence that comes in response to that oppression is a restorative violence. It's one that has the potential to restore the personhood to those oppressors. I think there is something beautiful in that.
Yeah, I agree.
But he does also say on 85 that no one can be authentically human while he prevents others from being so. So again, there's that kind of... It's dialectical. Your personhood is not a guarantee. You can lose it if you deny it to others. Yeah.
Yeah.
To talk about white savior education a little bit, on 95, he says, one cannot expect positive results from an education or political action program which fails to respect the particular view of the world held by the people. Such a program constitutes cultural invasion, good intentions notwithstanding. And it just got me thinking a lot about white saviorism in education, and the idea of your good intentions of coming in to help can often, regardless of those intentions, still be a form of cultural invasion, for sure.
Yeah. I have one on 144. I just love the way he says, however, the unconcealable antagonism which exists between the two classes makes this harmony impossible. The elites call for harmony between classes as if classes were fortuitous agglomerations of individuals curiously looking at a shop window on a Sunday afternoon.
Yeah.
It's like, no, man, you forget that you govern.
Yeah.
You know? I love that.
Yeah. I'll throw one more out on 151 since we're right here. At the bottom of 151, any populist leader who moves even discreetly toward the people in any way other than as the intermediary of the oligarchies will be curbed by the latter if they have sufficient force to stop him. And I can't help but think about Mamdani and all of the kind of populist center figures that have come out of the democratic socialists in the United States. You know, think about Bernie, think about AOC, think about Mamdani, and how they're never going to be it, man. They're never going to be it.
Yeah. I don't know. You know, I do agree. I mean, I've really been liking seeing Zoran run up the score in New York. That's been very fun.
I can appreciate what he's doing.
Yeah.
He also does have authority to arrest Netanyahu if he wants to.
But not according to his legal counsel. I don't know.
Fuck that. They fucking arrested Arafat in New York. The mayor arrested Arafat in New York in the 90s or whatever. What the fuck?
I don't know, dog. I mean, yeah. I think it's very clear what the limits of reformism are via him. You know, like, we don't need to get super into this or anything, but there was a great interview with Hassan and Norm Finkelstein.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and he said something that I really appreciated, and it was that Mamdani has all of this energy right now, all of this momentum, and what he's not doing is mobilizing. You know, it's like, this is the kind of moment where you need to take this energy and direct it in such a way, you know, like, I know that there's an interplay, like there's a balancing act between what you ask of the people and what you give to the people in politics. He's the mayor, you know, I know it's a complex scenario. The NYPD is a gang of its own right. All of these things, you know, but still, like, the kind of popular drive that Zoran has right now is something that is like, it's like golden.
But it's a fucking pressure valve, and it will be used to direct people toward the Democratic Party in 2028 when Kamala Harris runs with AOC as her running mate. And they're going to try to make that sound like a fucking...
Oh my gosh. I didn't know you were so cynical, man. No, I agree. Who knows, man? Who knows? Right now, I'm just trying to make sure it ain't going to be Vivek up here in fucking Ohio. So fucking funny, by the way, to see ads against Sherrod Brown because they make him sound so cool. They make him sound awesome. Yeah. The way that Sherrod Brown, you know, I know that he's a 30-year fucking long wet glove incumbent, essentially.
Yeah.
So, you know, why do all the ads make him sound like the most radical motherfucker in Ohio?
Yeah.
I know that that's not the case.
I wish.
Yeah.
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 So that was Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire.
What questions did this leave you with?
I mean, I've stated both my questions already, but my number one question is, what's his fucking beef with non-human animals? My second question is, why is defining a subject relevant? I'm still not settled on an answer to that question. I don't know that outside of the philosophical realm it has any bearing, and I'm not even certain I think it has meaningful bearing in the philosophical realm. So that question is standing with me. It's come up previously, mostly through interactions that I was having online, but this definitely reawakened that question for me. And I don't think it gave me a satisfying answer. What about you?
Yeah, I'm thinking the biggest question I had here really had to do with how this kind of dialogical practice could be put into place in the now. Not only in the classroom of the revolution, but also in the regular classroom. Because, you know, largely in the kinds of implementation that's occurred since the publishing of this book, where this kind of thing has been attempted, I feel that it has largely been co-opted. at least in America.
Yeah.
I can't speak for other educational contexts. So I'm just kind of curious, how Freirean does your vanguard really need to be? How dialogical? I guess really a better question is, how close is the idea of the mass line that's already practiced by kind of MLM vanguardist parties? How close is that to the Freirean ideal of the dialogical, group?
That's a good question.
I also am just curious about, anytime we talk about animals, I'm always curious about that because I just have less study there. But I'm curious about the kinds of examples that rebut Paulo Freire here. I know that that's a very specific and not important to the book thing, but just another question that I had during reading this. And is there any other, this is just a question in general, but is there any other Freire that's worth reading in this kind of context? Because I did enjoy this, even if it was a little weird here and there. So that's my question to you, audience.
Yeah, for sure. Which other pedagogy of the insert noun should we read from Freire?
Yeah.
Because he's got a lot of them.
Yeah. Okay. You should read this if... Well, no, I think it's pretty straightforward. I think you should read this if you intend to be a leader. I think if you intend to be a leader in the revolutionary sense, then I think that this is pretty critical reading, especially if you're someone who has maybe classical ideas of organization in your mind, not in the revolutionary sense, but in like the, traditional hierarchies and shit like that.
Yeah, that's good. I the two that I had are, you should read this if you're a pre-service teacher. That's when I read it, and I do think it changed my attitude toward the classroom in a positive way. And you should read this if you intend to be a part of the vanguard. I guess I was thinking of it specifically, the banking model, and like, what are the two applications? Well, if you want to be a teacher and if in the revolutionary application. So yeah, I like the way that you framed it, but I would say you should read this if you intend to be a part of the vanguard.
Yeah.
What did we completely miss, bungle?
What else should we read?
What else should we read? Please, we've enjoyed getting feedback from the audience, so if you have any thoughts, questions, concerns, comments, whatever.
Yeah, let us know. leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
That's right. And next episode, we're going to read Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next by Dean Spade. So our second reading of a book called Mutual Aid.
Yeah, a different mutual aid.
But a different one, yeah.
Yes. Hopefully you'll join us. I think it's going to be interesting. Talking about revolutionary praxis, I'm curious for the kind of immediate praxis, maybe some kind of a more immediate praxis right now. And so I think that this one has come highly recommended. I think it'll be pretty straightforward. And you should join us. Don't get left unread.
That's right. Bye-bye.
See ya.